that he was about 6 feet tall, that he was completely scourged all over his body, he was crucified.
What if The Passion of the Christ wasn't just a movie? What if behind one of the most powerful Christian films ever made was a story far stranger, far deeper than anything we saw on screen? From the outside, it was a groundbreaking film, bold, unflinching, unlike anything Hollywood had ever released about Jesus. But behind the scenes, something was different, something felt off. Crew members whispered about eerie coincidences. A strange weight hung over the set. People spoke of moments they couldn't explain, moments that still stay with them today. And at the center of it all, Mel Gibson. Why would he push to make a film? No studio wanted to fund. Why risk his career, his reputation, everything? Because this wasn't just a creative decision. It was something he felt called to do. Before a single frame was shot, before the blood, the cross, and the controversy, there was one man, not the superstar, not the Oscar winner, just Mel. Alone with a vision almost no one believed in. He didn't plan to make this film, he needed to. But even he couldn't have imagined what would follow. The trials, the spiritual weight, and the moments that would change him forever. It all started in the late 1990s. Mel had it all. Global fame, box office hits, creative control. But while the world saw success, something inside him was stirring. And what came next would take him into the deepest, darkest, and most sacred journey of his life. Behind the cameras, something was breaking inside Mel Gibson. He was battling demons that no spotlight could hide. Addiction, depression, and a deep sense of disconnection. His life, though outwardly successful, was quietly unraveling. He felt lost, hollow at times, dangerously close to the edge. But in the middle of that darkness, something unexpected happened. One day, overwhelmed by it all, he dropped to his knees. No script, no plan, just a raw cry for help. And in that moment, something shifted. He began to return to something he hadn't touched in years, his faith. But this wasn't a gentle rediscovery. It was fierce, urgent, almost obsessive. He started meditating on the Gospels, especially the parts where broken people cried out to God. Words he once read as a child, now hit with the force of revelation. And out of that brokenness came a vision, not of a film, but of a story that had to be told. Mel once said, "I was a bad guy, a really horrible guy. My sins were the first to nail him to the cross." That's why he couldn't tell this story like a Hollywood epic. He had to show it so real, as it truly was. He threw himself into research, not as a filmmaker, but as a man on a mission. He studied scripture, the stations of the cross, writings of saints and mystics. He searched for anything that could help him capture the full weight of Christ's final hours. He didn't want to modernize anything. If Jesus spoke, it would be in Aramaic, the Romans, Latin, no English, no shortcuts, no compromises. And that's when the doors started closing. He pitched the idea to studio after studio and got the same answer every time. A brutally realistic film spoken in dead languages with no commercial hook. They told him no one would watch it. They wouldn't fund a single frame. But Mel knew if he gave in even a little, the soul of the story would be lost. So he did the unthinkable. He funded it himself. $30 million from his own pocket to make the film, another $15 million for distribution and marketing. No investors, no studio safety net. If the film failed, it would take him down with it. But by then, it wasn't about risk. It wasn't even about reputation. It was a calling. And Mel Gibson was ready to walk through fire to tell the story exactly as he believed it happened. But Mel's next decision surprised everyone even more. He didn't want stars, no celebrities, no familiar faces to distract from the message. In his eyes, this story had to feel ancient, almost outside of time. Viewers shouldn't be watching actors. They needed to feel like they were witnessing Christ himself. That's why he chose Jim Caviezel. At the time, Jim was known for a few serious roles, but he wasn't a household name. What he was, however, was deeply committed to his faith, and that mattered to Mel. Jim had the intensity, the humility, and the quiet strength needed to carry the heaviest role ever written. When Mel offered him the part, Jim said yes without hesitation. But then something unusual happened. Mel called him back and warned him. He told Jim, "You might never work in this town again." The film was risky, too bold, too raw, too controversial. But Jim didn't flinch. He simply replied, "We all have to carry our crosses." And with that, everything was set in motion. Mel doubled down on authenticity. He made a bold announcement. The entire film would be shot in Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew, the languages of the time. No English, no modern phrasing, no hand-holding for the audience. His goal: total immersion. During filming, there would be no subtitle. The dialogue would be added later. But Mel believed that even without knowing the words, the audience would feel everything. The betrayal, the anguish, the sacrifice. Language became more than sound. It became texture. It shaped the world of the film. The sharp edge of Latin, the sorrowful rhythm of Aramaic. It made the story feel distant, yet heartbreakingly real. But that wasn't the only rule Mel broke. While Hollywood might have opted for green screens and CGI, Mel refused. He wanted earth underfoot, wind in the air, and sunlight that couldn't be faked. So he chose Matera, Italy, a stone-carved town that felt like it had never left the first century. Its hills were rough, the weather was punishing, the cold could cut through anything. But that was the point. On one of those hills, the crew built Golgotha, not a set, but a full crucifixion site. Wooden crosses, stone tools, dirt paths. Everything was real, everything was rough, and nothing was plastic. As filming approached, something shifted. The cast and crew began to sense it. This wasn't just another movie, Jim Caviezel would later admit. Everyone could feel it. Something was happening that no one could explain, something otherworldly. As production got underway, quiet stories began to surface about moments on set when everything fell still. About cast members unexpectedly moved to tears, and about an invisible presence that seemed to settle over the entire crew. It was more than mood or emotion. It was something deeper. As the cameras rolled for the Passion of the Christ, it became clear to many involved that this wasn't a normal set. What began as a spiritually serious project had started to feel otherworldly, even unsettling. Something that still leaves those who were there at a loss for words. And then came the lightning. Jim Caviezel had already accepted that the role would be physically punishing hours in full-body makeup, carrying the cross, enduring lashes, bruises, and blood. But what no one expected was nature itself turning against him, while filming a scene on the hill of Golgotha, standing high on the cross. Jim was struck by lightning. The set froze. For a moment, no one moved. The bolt knocked him off balance, and the impact caused him to bite through his tongue and cheeks. According to Jim, the after effects were severe, eventually leading to 2 heart surgeries, including open heart and a long period of recovery with medication. What makes it more eerie is that only minutes later, lightning struck again, this time hitting assistant director Jan Michelini, who had already been struck once earlier in production, twice in the same place on the same film in a matter of minutes. For scientists, it was an extreme rarity. But for those on set, it felt like something else entirely. Some said it was a sign. Others whispered it was a warning, and the stories didn't stop there. People began to speak quietly of a strange presence that lingered on set. Not something visible, but something they could feel. A weight in the air, an awareness they couldn't shake. Whether it was reverence, fear, or something beyond explanation, most agreed on one thing. This production had crossed into territory no one had anticipated. As filming continued, more unsettling reports began to surface. Crew members quietly admitted to feeling lightheaded, nauseous, or suddenly overwhelmed with emotion, but only during certain scenes. The whipping, the carrying of the cross, the moment of death. It was as if something unseen pressed in during those sequences, and even the most seasoned professionals felt it. Mel Gibson, usually calm and composed on set, was seen stepping away during those moments. Some said he was praying, others said he was crying. Weather in Matera, Italy, normally stable and dry, suddenly turned unpredictable. Clear skies would darken in minutes, then return just as quickly to stillness. One scene might start under soft morning sun, only to be interrupted by violent gusts of wind that knocked over equipment and sent tents flying. Sandstorms would sweep through out of nowhere, then vanish without warning. At a certain point, it stopped feeling like bad luck and started to feel like something else, something no one could quite name. Then came the physical toll, especially on Jim Caviezel, the man portraying Jesus. Some began to wonder if he was just playing the role, or actually living it. During the scourging scene, the whips were carefully choreographed to miss his skin. But on one take, the angle shifted slightly and a metal barb struck him directly. It tore into his back and left a scar that stretched 14 inches. Later, while carrying the heavy cross, Jim slipped and dislocated his shoulder. Many of the screams you hear in the final cut weren't part of the performance. They were real, and makeup artists revealed they couldn't always tell the difference between bruises they'd applied and the ones that had appeared naturally on his body. As the crucifixion scenes were shot in cold, stormy conditions, Jim developed hypothermia. His body was pushed to the brink physically, emotionally, and spiritually. He endured everything from open wounds to extreme exhaustion. And here's something that gave many people pause. Jim Caviezel shares the same initials as Jesus Christ, JC, and he was 30 years old during filming. The same age Jesus was at his crucifixion. Coincidence or something more? No one could say for sure, but it added one more layer of mystery to what was already unfolding. Jim wasn't the only one affected. Several cast members reportedly fell ill during or after intense scenes. Some developed fevers, others suffered from insomnia or strange nightmares. The weight of the film seemed to follow them home. Through it all, Mel Gibson never publicly acknowledged anything supernatural happening on set. But those around him saw a change. He became quieter, more inward. He began each day in prayer and was often seen pacing early in the morning, whispering scripture under his breath. Whatever was happening behind the scenes, one thing was certain. This wasn't just filmmaking anymore. It was something much deeper. Somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like a film set and started feeling like a battlefield. Not between actors and critics, but between something older, deeper. Between forces of good and evil. For Mel Gibson, The Passion of the Christ wasn't just a movie, it was a spiritual weapon. What happened during production, he would later say, wasn't just intense, it was unexplainable. When the film finally premiered on February 25, 2004, it didn't arrive quietly. It hit like a detonation. By that point, Hollywood had already turned its back on Mel. Critics were sharpening their knives before the first frame even hit the screen, and religious leaders were preparing either to defend it or denounce it loudly. But no one, not the studios, not the press, not even the churches, was fully prepared for what happened next. This wasn't a typical movie launch. There were no red carpets, no celebrity panels, no appearances on late-night TV. Mel bypassed the entire Hollywood marketing machine. Instead, he turned directly to the church. Evangelical pastors, Catholic priests, and Christian leaders across denominations were given early access. Screenings weren't held in Beverly Hills, but in church basements, fellowship halls, and modest conference rooms across the country. Word spread fast, and from the pulpits, pastors began endorsing the film with a passion of their own. They called it the most powerful portrayal of Christ ever seen on screen. The faith community responded like wildfire. Entire congregations began booking out theaters. Church buses transported members in groups. Some pastors even scheduled sermons to align with the film's release. For many believers, watching The Passion of the Christ wasn't just entertainment, it was a spiritual event. And just like that, Mel Gibson's independent, controversial, and once rejected project turned into one of the most talked about cultural moments in modern film history. Analysts were stunned. The Passion of the Christ opened on Ash Wednesday with an explosive $23.5 million on its very first day. By the end of its opening weekend, it had pulled in over $83 million, shattering expectations, and claiming the biggest February debut in box office history at the time. And it didn't slow down. Despite being an R-rated religious film with subtitles, no major stars, and relentless violence, the crowds kept coming. By the end of its theatrical run, the film had earned around $370 million in the US alone and over $611 million worldwide, becoming the highest-grossing R-rated film in history. At that point, this wasn't just a success, it was a cultural earthquake. A $30 million independent film funded entirely by Mel Gibson had outperformed Hollywood's biggest productions, and the industry didn't know how to respond. But with that kind of success came a flood of criticism. Even before the film was released, controversy was brewing. Several Jewish organizations, including the Anti-Defamation League, voiced deep concern over the film's portrayal of Jews in the narrative. They argued that the movie echoed centuries-old accusations that held the Jewish people solely responsible for Jesus' death. Abraham Foxman, then, head of the ADL, warned that the film could inflame dormant anti-Semitism in those already predisposed to believe it. Mel Gibson pushed back, insisting the film simply followed the Gospels. He claimed there was no agenda, just a faithful depiction of Scripture. But for many critics, that explanation didn't go far enough. The backlash spread quickly across news outlets, religious forums, opinion columns, and talk shows. The film became a flashpoint in a broader cultural debate. Another lightning rod was the violence. Critics called the film excessively brutal, unrelenting in its depiction of pain. The scourging scene alone, which lasted nearly 10 minutes, was singled out as especially disturbing. Some reviewers accused Gibson of glorifying the violence. Others questioned whether the suffering had overshadowed the message. Reports from theaters were dramatic. Some audience members fainted, others vomited. Many left in tears. Even veteran critics were shaken. Roger Ebert, who ultimately admired the film's ambition, wrote, "The movie is 126 minutes long, and I would guess that at least 100 of those minutes, maybe more, are concerned specifically and graphically with the details of the torture and death of Jesus. This is the most violent film I have ever seen." But despite the outrage, the protests, and the headlines, people kept showing up in droves. Critic David Anson once wrote, "Instead of being moved by Christ's suffering or awed by his sacrifice, I felt abused by a filmmaker intent on punishing an audience for who knows what sins." The reaction was harsh, but Mel Gibson stayed largely silent. He let the film speak for itself. Internationally, the Passion of the Christ stirred just as much intensity. In Mexico, audiences embraced it with passionate devotion. In Italy and Poland, Catholic moviegoers packed theaters night after night. In Brazil, it was shown in both slums and cathedrals. But in France and Germany, where the wounds of anti-Semitism are still deeply felt, the pushback was stronger. Some theaters refused to screen it entirely. Inside Christian circles, however, the film took on a life of its own. Many described it as a divine work of art. Viewers spoke of spiritual awakenings, emotional healing, and in some cases, physical restoration. Churches used it as a tool to reignite conversations about Christ's sacrifice. Evangelists distributed copies for outreach. For many believers, this wasn't just a film. It was the most powerful tool for evangelism since the Bible itself. But outside the sanctuary, critics, academics, and filmmakers saw something very different. They accused Mel of using the film to deepen religious divides, glorify violence, and push a rigid worldview. And eventually, the scrutiny turned personal. Journalists began digging into Mel's background. His father's controversial Holocaust denial statements resurfaced. His own interviews, often defensive, sometimes cryptic, added fuel to the fire. Suddenly, The Passion of the Christ was no longer just a movie. It had become a cultural fault line. When the dust began to settle, one thing was undeniable. The film had changed the movie industry. It proved what Hollywood had ignored for years. There was a massive devoted Christian audience that wasn't being served. Studios scrambled to catch up, rushing to produce faith-based films like God's Not Dead, Heaven Is for Real, and War Room. But none came close to the emotional or cultural impact of The Passion. It remained the gold standard, the one everyone imitated, but no one matched. Eventually, the headlines faded. The controversy quieted. The screens went dark. But for those who lived through the making of The Passion of the Christ, the story didn't end with the credits. In many ways, it had only just begun. What happened to the cast? The crew and even Mel Gibson in the months and years after release was almost as mysterious as the filming itself. Some experienced profound spiritual change. Others stepped out of the spotlight entirely. And some seemed to carry invisible wounds they've never spoken about. A pattern began to emerge, one that those closest to the production either couldn't explain or simply chose not to. Let's start with Jim Caviezel. Before The Passion, he was on the rise. He'd co-starred with Jennifer Lopez in Angel Eyes, earned critical praise for The Thin Red Line, and held his own alongside Dennis Quaid in Frequency Hollywood. Saw him as a clean-cut, bankable lead with serious range. Then he played Jesus and everything changed. You'd expect the phones to start ringing, but they didn't. The offers didn't flood in. In fact, the opposite happened. His career cooled almost overnight. In the years that followed, it became clear that playing Jesus had come with a cost. Inside Hollywood, quiet rumors began to spread. Some said Jim Caviezel was too religious. Others claimed he was difficult to work with. But those closest to the industry whispered something more serious, that he'd been quietly blacklisted. Taking the role of Christ and aligning himself so publicly with Mel Gibson had made him radioactive in certain circles. Jim later reflected on that shift. In one interview, he said, "All of a sudden, I stopped being one of the 5 most popular actors in the studio, and I hadn't done anything wrong. I just played Jesus." And yet, despite the consequences, Jim never expressed regret. In fact, he's said that if he had to do it all over again, he would without hesitation. Because for him, the Passion of the Christ wasn't just a career choice, it was a calling. Since then, Jim has leaned fully into his faith. He's taken on more Christian-themed roles, spoken at religious conferences, and become increasingly bold about sharing his beliefs. In interviews, he often grows emotional when speaking about the impact the film had on his soul. He once said, "I had no choice but to defend my faith at that point. I was called anti-Semitic and everything, but I stood firm for Mel Gibson. The success of The Passion should have been a career-defining victory. He'd proven the doubters wrong. He made a global blockbuster in ancient languages without stars and without studio support. But while the film soared, his personal life unraveled. In 2006, just 2 years after the film's release, Mel was arrested for driving under the influence. During the arrest, he launched into a drunken tirade filled with anti-Semitic slurs, a moment that shattered his image and effectively torpedoed his career. The headlines were brutal, the fallout immediate, and it didn't stop there. In the years that followed, more scandals surfaced. Angry voicemails were leaked. Public meltdowns made tabloid covers. Accusations of verbal abuse and erratic behavior piled on. To many, it looked like a complete fall from grace, but some, especially those who worked with him, on The Passion, saw things differently. They believed there was more going on beneath the surface. That the toll of telling this story, the weight of the backlash, and the spiritual warfare surrounding the film had taken a deeper toll than anyone realized. They say the film changed Mel Gibson, that in his obsessive pursuit to portray Christ's suffering with complete authenticity, something shifted inside him. Mel himself has admitted he was never quite the same after making The Passion of the Christ. Over the years, he's hinted, sometimes cryptically, that the backlash he faced both personally and professionally wasn't entirely natural. In his view, it was the cost of completing a divine assignment. Even now, he refers to The Passion as the most important work of his life. And despite all the controversy, he's never wavered in that belief. In recent years, he's been quietly developing a sequel, though few details have been made public. What's perhaps most curious is how little he speaks about the original film today. According to those close to him, there are parts of that journey he simply won't revisit. Entire chapters remain off limits. But Mel and Jim weren't the only ones affected. Behind the camera crew, members began experiencing their own quiet transformations. Some started reading the Bible during lunch breaks. Others reported vivid dreams, moments of unexpected emotion, or a pull towards something bigger than themselves. Technicians, extras, caterers, people whose names never appeared in the credits shared stories of sudden spiritual clarity. A few even asked for baptisms before production had wrapped. One of the most striking accounts came from Luca Lionello, the actor who played Judas, a self-declared atheist at the time he converted to Christianity after his experience on set. But what might be even more telling is the silence. To this day, many of those involved refuse to talk about what happened. Actors who played background roles, Roman soldiers, townspeople have repeatedly declined interviews. Crew members have admitted off the record that they're simply not comfortable revisiting the experience. Journalists who tried to follow up after production often ran into dead ends, encountering a strange, consistent wall of silence. There's no scandal, no cover-up, just quiet. Those who do speak say it was spiritually intense, even overwhelming, something that went far beyond a normal film set. And for those who don't, some believe it's because what they experienced felt sacred and they don't want to disturb it. Others think they may have seen or felt things they can't explain and don't know how to put into words. And then there are whispers that what happened during The Passion went beyond cinema, beyond storytelling, that it crossed into something spiritual, maybe even supernatural, and that everyone who was there knows it. Because for them, The Passion of the Christ wasn't just a film, it marked a line in their lives, a clear before and after. Jim Caviezel paid with his career, Mel Gibson paid with his reputation, and countless others walked away, changed, humbled, haunted, or healed. But almost none of them regret it. They saw something, they felt something, and they know that what happened on that set can't be captured in a documentary or fully explained in an interview. It was personal. It was sacred. And in some quiet, mysterious way, it may still be unfolding. Maybe that's why the silence remains, because The Passion of the Christ wasn't just about Jesus. For those who made it, it became their own cross to carry. But what about you? Do you believe The Passion of the Christ was just a film, or was it something more? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and watch the next one on screen. There's more to this journey than what you think.